I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. When cinema mogul John L. Santikos died in 2014, he left his movie theaters and real estate holdings to charity, and coming in at $605 million, it was the largest philanthropic gift in the country at that time. But the cinema mogul also left behind a huge headache, as officials at the company and the San Antonio Area Foundation were left to figure out how the gift, most of it tied up in real estate, could deliver the greatest benefit to charities. I'm joined now by the Express News reporting team of Joshua Fechter and Madison Isler to learn more about this very detailed story. So Joshua and Madison, thank you both for joining me here on the podcast today. Before we get into this headache, how I mentioned earlier, of how to turn the company profits into charitable donations, tell me about the life and wealth building of the late John L. Santikos.
John Santikos' father, Louis Santikos, founded Santikos Theaters after their family fled Europe during the Greek Civil War. That followed World War II. John Santikos later took over the business, but for a brief period in the 90s, he managed the theaters. And during all that time, he was not only managing theaters, he was amassing raw land for development. He was acquiring offices, office space, shopping centers. So basically, this business not only thrives off of the profits from the theaters and the theater holdings, but also sees a lot of income from its real estate holdings, be that leasing office space, leasing shopping center space, or any proceeds from the sale of raw vacant land.
So Santikos died in 2014, and that donation more than tripled the assets held by the San Antonio Area Foundation to nearly $1 billion, a sum far more than the community foundation had ever managed before. I'm wondering, how did John Santikos envision his donation would operate? Obviously, further on in the conversation, we're talking about some difficulties they encountered and some plans for the future, what's going on right now. But what was his idea for all this? I assume he had to have some idea of what was going to happen. That's a lot of money to leave a charitable organization.
So a couple of years ago, John Santikos and Dennis Knoll, who was then the head of the San Antonio Area Foundation, began kind of meeting secretly, privately, about what was going to happen to the Santikos assets after John Santikos died. So basically what John Santikos communicated to the Area Foundation was that he wanted the business to basically continue as is, to become an asset of the Area Foundation that produces profits that go toward charitable gifts set out in his will, in his living trust. But his will never completely specifies that the businesses would continue in perpetuity, but Area Foundation officials and officials with the Santikos company will tell you that it was his strong intent for those businesses to continue and to thrive.
So the plan, Joshua, was for the theaters and real estate holdings to continue functioning as businesses, as you just mentioned. There have been some problems. This concept came as streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and others, they're really changing the business of movie distribution. There's also, aside from that, been a communications breakdown between the boards of Santikos Enterprises and the San Antonio Area Foundation that has further really complicated what they've been trying to do. In addition to that, there's also been millions spent for renovations on the property and the assets that were donated following Santikos' death in 2014. So what all has been happening since that time? Obviously, it's been several years.
In that time, Santikos has spent millions building new theaters, renovating existing ones. They've added things like reclining seats, new sound systems, different food options. They're currently working on a big project out in Cibolo, which opens later this week. It's an 87,000 square foot megaplex that has bowling and laser tag and virtual reality, along with movies. Which is kind of the approach that they and other theater chains of all sizes are taking as they face competition from Netflix and Amazon and other streaming services, trying to diversify what they're offering in terms of entertainment options.
And at the same time, Santikos and the Area Foundation simultaneously have had a bit of executive turmoil. Dennis Knoll, the head of the San Antonio Area Foundation, left in 2017. David Holmes, who was picked to lead the Santikos company after John Santikos died, left in November 2018 and was replaced by Tim Handren, who is the former chief operating officer at USAA. He's also a Santikos board member. David Holmes was actually handpicked by John Santikos previously to handle the company while John Santikos underwent a bout of chemotherapy. So he was kind of trusted to figure out the inner workings of the company. And in November 2018, he went on a leave of absence and later decided that he wasn't going to come back to the company because he had to deal with health problems, according to the Santikos board chair, Ed Kelly.
So, Madison, what you said a moment ago is really interesting to me. The idea that they're opening, new theaters and they're trying to do new concepts to compete with these online streaming entities and other things that are, preventing someone from going to a movie theater nowadays. But as we'll talk about, hopefully maybe right now, the numbers for movie theaters, despite all of these other attractions that can take people's time, are actually looking pretty good. So, despite all the challenges that were just mentioned, the actual outlook on this situation is positive. If you talk to the people who are in charge of it, I'm wondering what their plan is, in addition for all the things that you just mentioned, Madison, to try to make the wishes of this man who left them millions of dollars in 2014 to try to make this sustainable for the future. How do they think they're going to do that?
Santikos CEO Tim Handren wants to get back to building a new theater every 12 to 18 months. He says it's what John Santikos was doing in his prime, and it's what he would have wanted. And he's bullish on the theater industry, despite competition from Netflix, Amazon, other streaming services. For example, the U.S. and Canada box office hit a record $11.9 billion in last year, and ticket sales went up, according to a report by the Motion Picture Association of America. Their newest theater project is out in Cibolo, and it opens May 23rd. And it's a mix of an array of different entertainment options. There are nice screens and reclining seats and all of that, but there's also bowling, laser tag, virtual reality, different food options, etc. Just different things to get people in the door.
So Joshua and Madison, in your write-up now available at expressnews.com, you mentioned how this setup to fund money to charity isn't typical. I guess when something like this happens, it's done slightly differently than it is here. And the role of taxes and even tax breaks for the Santikos family and how that fits all into this, those details and a lot more is available at expressnews.com. I'd love to hear about a little bit about these topics now. How exactly is this all put together as an organization, and how does that compare maybe to other situations that are more common? And I know you didn't get any comments from Santikos family members for this story, but they also were mentioned as well.
So basically, the way that this whole enterprise works now is that the real estate assets and the theater operations are organized under an entity called Santikos Enterprises. The profits from Santikos Enterprises then flow to the Santikos, what's called the John L. Santikos Charitable Foundation, and then that foundation is under the ownership of the San Antonio Area Foundation. People have seen this business model before. Newman's owned the food company that was co-founded by the actor Paul Newman. The way that company works is that it gives its profit to the Newman's Own Foundation, which then distributes the funds to charitable causes. So it's not a model that's never been tried before, but it is still a fairly uncommon one. So we didn't hear back from the family on how this all affected how they benefited from the will. But tax experts tell us that by giving the real estate assets and the theaters to the Area Foundation, that Santikos heirs likely got a sizable break on their real estate tax burden.
Also, something that was interesting that I read in your article available online at expressnews.com was this idea of whether or not running a nonprofit that runs companies is actually fair. And the Santikos Charitable Foundation's nonprofit status actually gives it a tax-free window to pay down debt on much of its real estate portfolio. So once again, as part of that will from 2014, it was the movie theater entities and also real estate, the two big parts that were then given and now operated with the idea of giving the money to charity. So I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts on the idea of fairness and how this situation compares to regular companies that might have similar types of assets.
The way this operates is that the profit from the theaters and real estate assets flow to the charitable foundation and are then dispersed for charitable causes. That doesn't mean that they don't have to pay taxes on the income from those operations. So they actually pay comparable levels. Think about corporate tax. Santikos basically pays, even though they're no longer a for-profit operation, comparable levels of tax that you would see in a private company, a for-profit company. But they do have a particular carve-out for their real estate assets, for their assets that yield rental income, such as their offices, such as their retail shopping centers. So they have about a 10-year window, and it's about 7 years now, that they have to pay down the debt on those assets. And if they can pay down the debt on those assets before the end of that window, they will no longer have to pay taxes on those. Those will be tax-free in perpetuity. So a lot of people I talked to basically said, this isn't a tax dodge. It's not unfair because they are paying similar levels of corporate tax. They're choosing to keep the company as an operating business rather than liquidating it. And when it comes to these kinds of charitable donations in a business person's will, it's typical for this kind of donation to be made in order to give some kind of estate tax benefit to the business person's heirs.
And then finally, Joshua and Madison, before we say goodbye, I definitely want to get to the charitable aspects of this entire situation. And a question that you also asked in your article about whether or not this situation is giving enough to the community. So since John Santikos died, his estate and the Area Foundation have granted more than $53 million to organizations, including the Southwest School of Art, City Education Partners, and San Antonio Sports. So tell me a little bit about these and other gifts that you know about, as well as the difficulties that have been encountered along the road. And then maybe if you have any ideas on maybe whether or not they'll have more charitable donations in the future.
So in his will, John Santikos specified 2 specific gifts to Doctors Without Borders and International Orthodox Christian Charities. Both of those entities receive 10% of the charitable contributions made through the foundation. Otherwise, John Santikos laid out a series of areas where he wanted his money to go. Causes that would benefit seniors, those with special needs, victims of child abuse, disaster relief, public libraries, parks, museums, art, healthcare, and medical research. The company doesn't have any estimates right now of how much it will give this year. It doesn't have those, or it did not make public any estimates. But the Area Foundation said they intend for the assets to produce anywhere from $10 million to $20 million a year that will go towards charitable causes.
And Santikos is opening its newest theater May 23rd, the Megaplex in Cibolo, and we'll see if they go back to building a new theater every 12 to 18 months, as CEO Tim Handren says John Santikos would have wanted.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News writers Joshua Fechter and Madison Isler for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.